Good evening, and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott, and tonight we'll be returning to one of our favorite topics here on Public Perspective, and that is education. Our guest tonight is Byron Sigcho. Byron is the lead instructor at UIC in the Center for Literacy, and he's also a PhD candidate there in the School of Public Policy. Byron, thank you so much for being here.
Good evening. Thank you for having me, Kevin. It's good to be here.
So we're here tonight to talk specifically about charter schools. For those in our audience who aren't familiar, charters are, actually I'll let you explain charters. You're the guest, you get to tell us what constitutes a charter school.
Well, charter schools have been part of the most recent education reform at the national level, at the state level. So charter schools have been, there's a misconception often is that they think that they are some kind of private so that they're actually public schools that are privately managed. So
but they're funded by public dollars.
By the public dollars, right? So it is important to make that clarification. Often is that we have that misconception. But those are public schools, but the main characteristic is that they are funded privately under the assumption that they're going to be managed more efficiently, or there will be more accountability even oftentimes. But that's what we'd like maybe to discuss more in detail and see if they are they're true to their mission.
Right. So a charter is a school funded by public dollars, the same dollars that would otherwise go into the public education system, but managed by a private organization, sometimes a for-profit company, sometimes a not-for-profit, but a private entity that does not actually report up the government hierarchy of leadership, correct?
Absolutely, that's correct.
So your background is, you've looked a lot at finance of these groups, and what do you see? Briefly, what does looking at, and first of all, why did you start looking at the finance, and then what have you discovered once you started taking a look?
Yeah, well, my background is in economics, but now currently I'm looking into public policy, education in particular. And when we start first looking into some of the disconnections, I mean, I remember we were actually working on a project advocating for more public funding for charter schools. But then in my work in the Center for Literacy, talking to parents, talking to students, to teachers, we see some disconnections between what we were advocating for and it was actually what was implemented in the classroom. So that's what I became first interested to see where were why those disconnections occur when we were saying that we were giving more public dollars for schools that were supposedly functioning very well, high performing, but often we will get parents coming and telling us otherwise, that the services were not available, or students were being pushed out of the classroom for many reasons. Teachers working overtime,
not being paid for.
And obviously, after a few years being borne out, and we're losing good teachers in this school. So I was trying to be more cautious about what we're advocating for. So in the study, some of my studies starting shifting gears and say, well, what are we really for? And questioning some of the assumptions about charter schools. And I think that's very important that we start discussing. I think there's a discussion is long overdue.
But it's only just now starting to happen, I feel. I know you, as I'm sure you know, the public perception seems to be charter schools are this great alternative to failing public schools, and that's the answer, and we should all be looking at charters. And there are people in public policy, like Mayor Rahm Emanuel is a fan of charter schools, though newly elected Mayor Bill de Blasio in New York is not. So are we just beginning to see this debate starting to take shape?
I think so. Yeah, I think we finally have a more open discussion and a really more objective discussion about charter schools. I think historically you just look at historically about what charters or how charters started. Actually, charters started as an alternative, yes, indeed, to public schools, trying to tailor to those students with special needs, special needs students, trying to reduce the overcrowding classrooms that we have, trying to do more innovative models, and actually getting more support from those because oftentimes those students need extra resources. So they started as public schools, but they needed perhaps more resources from the private sector. Now what we see nowadays is completely different to how those charter schools started, and I think that's what we see a change in the debate almost. I mean, because we're debating about now charters are not a complement to the existing public schools, but almost in competition with public schools, and I think that we ought to be looking at how that debate has changed, but we haven't having a discussion about it. I mean, we just take support for charter schools. Granted, those are the high performing,
right.
and that's the silver bullet for education. And when we start doing some analysis of the finance, even in the performing aspect of the charter schools, we see that silver bullet perhaps is
not so silver.
Not so silver. That's right.
So you mentioned earlier the disconnect that the parents were bringing to your attention as you went through these studies. What exactly were they seeing? What kind of services were not being provided?
Some of the services that we started noticing was especially, and it's interesting because it's almost a paradox. I mean, the charter schools started tailoring to special needs students, and those students with special needs were actually the ones that are being most affected by the new implemented charter schools. So we see students with
affected positively or negatively?
Negatively.
Negatively.
In a way, because the services are less available. So often public schools, because of, as we were saying, they're interconnected, we're in part of the same system. So every increase in funding for charter schools means a decrease for public schools.
It's all the same pot of money that's funding all of this. Right?
Absolutely right, especially when the state. So when the state is in troubles, right, it's obviously cutting all across the board. But if there's preferential treatment, there may be some politics behind also that may be affecting the funding. So we start seeing, especially those services for special education, or also for like services like English as a second language. Those kind of services not being available when the funding was there.
So the public schools would provide those services. Now that money gets diverted to the charters, and the services are less available at the charters.
Right,
correct?
because the charters are not offering them.
So it's becoming unavailable, not just less available,
not
but
less available,
unavailable
oftentimes, right? So now we see parents having to travel long distances to find, we have, children with special needs, and oftentimes we have parents traveling miles across the city trying to find those services because they are not available.
So how does that happen? We talked a little bit before the show about the fact that charters are essentially an unregulated industry, but because they're funded by public education dollars. Public education, for example, the public schools, as I'm sure you know, are required to take everybody who enrolls, whether they're homeless, whether they have learning disabilities. Up until I believe it's the age of 20 in high school, you can still take the students. So that's the charter of the public schools. They need to take everybody, and they need to provide services for everyone as well. Why does that not apply to charters? It's all the same money. Why? How did they skate away from that?
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting question. So I think charter schools don't feel like they because they're privately run. So there's not I don't think there's a clear law that requires. I mean, we don't have that. What is applies for public schools may not necessarily apply for a private entity. So we have other kind of systems like a lottery system or a selective enrollment system, but we don't really have a law that that makes us look into those systems and see if those systems are really they're really honoring what they're saying. If it's truly a lottery, or if we are picking and choosing from the students rather than actually having a random lottery.
Yes,
so there's not a law that so when we look into it, oftentimes, even FOIA requests are not being
FOIA, for those who don't know, Freedom of Information Act.
Freedom of Information.
Right, where you're allowed to get government documents simply by requesting them, and the law requires that people turn over those government documents, right? So you've made some FOIA requests to some of these charter networks, right?
That's absolutely right, yeah.
And what's been the response?
And not only me, I think, in fact, in Chicago, I think that, even aldermen have made requests to look into these charter operators, and without a favorable response. I mean, I think I was talking to one of the aldermen, and he was still waiting for an answer about the meeting with this charter network to explain how the lottery actually works. Because we have actually another interesting factor that we talked a little bit also was about some of these charter networks actually seem to be targeting on tailoring to certain populations too. So we have the United Neighborhood Organization with a 98% Latino enrollment.
So 98% of the students in this entire network are Hispanic, right?
Hispanic, that's correct. but oftentimes or sometimes they're not really even operating in a, in
majority
a
Hispanic
majority
neighborhood?
Hispanic neighborhood.
And
So,
yet it's still 98%
but still
Hispanic.
managed to have an
And
98%.
supposedly it's random lottery.
Absolutely. So
You begin to see the disconnect
So
here, right?
there's some disconnects, and as I said, not only I'm not the only one who has made that claim. There are even aldermen who actually on the neighborhoods when they start seeing a particular trend, when they wonder, well, how this lottery is really operating. And then we don't have access because, as we said, as we don't have a clear law, and even so, we ought to be actually relooking at a FOIA.
Well, in fact, it raises a good question. Are the FOIA laws even applicable? Because these organizations are private, even though they use public funding. Are they even subject to the FOIA laws?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and there's
there's a debate about
there's
that,
debate
right?
about it, and I think there's the law is not very clear about this, and I think that's what we have these funny answers when we don't really have requests being answered in what it is public information, because these are publicly funded institutions.
Right. At least we think it should be.
Or at least we think
Right.
they should be, right?
Right. So you talked earlier about performance as well, and I know from my own reading of stories about charter schools that kind of across the board, if you look nationwide, the performance of charter schools is really not significantly different from the performance of public schools. There are some charters that excel. There are some charters that are way behind. So do we need to reevaluate that argument? I mean, the argument really for charters, certainly that we hear today, is they're better. You know, it's an alternative. The failing public schools create a whole bunch of charters, and things will get better. But we're not seeing that play out quite like that, are we?
Yeah, I mean, I think that you just hit at the nail there, because, and I can quote there's a national report. I think one of the most complete and comprehensive reports is the Credo. It's a Credo report by Stanford University, which is one of the few actually national studies on charter schools. Because it's really complicated to analyze charters as a whole, because there's even distinctions and different cities, different urban, rural. But a Credo study, which is I think one of the most more complete and more comprehensive studies, found that only a quarter of charter schools actually outperform
the public
public
and would that be like the corresponding public schools in those areas?
Exactly. When we do vis-a-vis studies, only a quarter of them. That means that there's really, we really ought to be looking this more carefully. In Chicago, it's interesting because we may see even like Noble Street, which is another charter network, who claims like, well, 10 out of the top, 9 out of the top 10 schools in Chicago are from our network. But when we again analyze, well, what is the secret sauce? What is the secret sauce in your schools? We see that they actually have high expulsion rates. I mean, so their students are 11 times more likely to be expelled from their schools than in the public schools.
So even though it's theoretically it's all takers, they take all students, they weed them out throughout the course of the education program, right?
Absolutely.
And expulsion has its own series of costs. I mean, there are some people who would react to that and say, well, that's the way it should be. These students, clearly, they're troublemakers and they're gangbangers and they're whatever, and they deserve to get booted out. But that has social costs on the other side, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, and also we see that oftentimes, I mean, the reasons for expulsion are not necessarily justified. I think oftentimes these high-performing schools attract certain families that often are looking for alternatives, families that are very engaged in education, and whose kids are really trying. I mean, we have families actually paying in fees quite significant amount of money because in order to keep their kids in these schools. So we have families, and the reasons, I mean, for the most common reasons for like fines and detention and expulsion are, I mean, can range from like chewing gum to having your tide, misplaced, or, I mean, we don't.
And there are actually monetary fines that they level against the students?
There are fines, I mean, we have, cases of families that have claimed to have fees of $300, $400. I mean, we're talking about low-income families too.
Right.
85% of Chicago public schools tailor, low-income families, families of minority families, and we, let's see what represents $300, $400 for families. So they're really
that
trying.
That can be a lot of money.
That can be a lot of money, and I mean, sometimes they force them to go to. I mean, they ask and they require them because of sometimes a poor grade, or because of their behavior, they require them to do summer school, but they charge them for the summer school. So $1,400, $1,500 is the range that I heard families paying for summer school.
Now I know public schools charge for summer school, but it's a minimal fee.
But it's a minimal fee. I mean, we're talking about, that's what made the distinction. I mean, we're talking
It's
about
like in the hundreds of dollars.
in the hundreds of dollars,
not
not the
15 or 100 or 2,000.
2,000 range, right? So there are differences, especially. I mean, we're really worried about the expulsion rates. I mean, that's really have, as you were saying, social impact. I mean, we don't know what's going to be the effect on those children who perhaps otherwise would be fine if they wouldn't, because of very harsh, they call them zero tolerance policies.
Right.
I mean, zero tolerance, I think, and there's been discussion about the actual legitimacy of these policies, when children oftentimes they'd rather be in detention than in a classroom that may be poorly managed, right? So we have to be looking at that, or if there's a more of an economic incentive for these. We're talking about schools like Noble or UNO, the United Neighborhood Organization, who have raised hundreds of thousands of dollars in fees to the students. So we wonder, is there economic incentive? Or really, a policy that is working for the students.
But now they also are reimbursed based on their head count as well of students, right? So if they, like I know in public schools, it's the attendance rate. You have a daily average attendance rate that determines what your state funding is. So I would think similarly in charter schools, the daily attendance rate. I mean, if they are expelling students, that population is shrinking, which would decrease their reimbursement from the state, would it not?
Interesting question, and it's a very interesting question. I think again we go to like very loosey ends, very loose laws that allow for these kind of things to happen. But oftentimes, what the allocation is determined in the first few weeks of the school year. That doesn't mean that the student is going to end up in that school.
So that student population can attenuate pretty dramatically, but the funding stays the same?
The funding stays the same because the funding is allocated, based on the enrollment that you declare
at the beginning of the year.
That doesn't mean that you honor those services, throughout the year. So you have, because of expulsion rates, because of different reasons, you have less students to worry about. And where are those students going? Back to public schools?
Yes, public schools have to pull them in.
Pull them in because by law they're required.
They must, right.
And they're underfunded because they did not receive the funding from the students that now they have to service.
That funding's going to the charter instead, because again, it's all the same pot of money.
Because it's the same pot of money, absolutely. So, that's what I think we have said in some of the studies we've done. I mean, we have a very dysfunctional system. Now that and I think we mentioned that earlier on. I mean, that when we're talking, like, we're not saying that all charters are the same, but unfortunately we've seen that a lot of the large charter networks that receive significant funding operate in very similar ways, where they receive upfront the funding, but they don't necessarily honor the services.
The mission. That they're supposed to deliver.
To deliver.
Now, you mentioned earlier, before the show, you were talking about some of the bond funding and just the overall funding scheme, and that there are significant differences between the funding in the public schools, where there are unions and the teachers get paid a certain amount and administrators get paid a certain amount, but that can be quite different at the charter schools. And then I think you also mentioned that there's some unaccounted for money. What's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, because as charter schools, are run by private entities, but they're also public. They receive public funding. So in between these pseudo public institutions that they have, they are allowed to issue, as they grow. I mean, many of them have become charter operators with multiple schools. Noble operates, 20 schools. United Neighborhood Organization operates, 16 schools, and they have plans for growth, for growth. So oftentimes, we see bonds as the preferred method of
financing. And schools do that. Schools issue bonds all the time,
and even public schools can do that. But when they're public funding, there should be public accountability and how those funds are being allocated. And I think that's the big difference. We see, in districts, in public districts, you account to the penny where the money goes. And oftentimes in charter schools, we see that we don't have the same transparency and accountability when it comes to finance. And we have seen oftentimes, and I give you an example. I like to talk with examples because we can always generalize.
Right, but these are real things
But these
you've
are real
seen.
things with real people involved. So in the United Neighborhood Organization, there was the issue approximately 30 million, back in 2011, I believe, they issued $30 million in bonds to sustain and grow their operations. They were telling their investors actually that they were actually making money. They show
Even though they're a not-for-profit.
even though they were not for profit, and they were telling Chicago public schools that were already under hard conditions, economic conditions, they were telling CPS that they were breaking even, that they actually in fact needed more money.
But they're telling the investors, that they're making a profit.
They're making a profit, and we're talking about like a $5 million profit
Out of $30 million
out of $30 million loan. So we wonder, well, what is the truth then? I mean, are you really breaking even at the point that they were asking Chicago public schools, give me more money, and they were sending parents to Springfield to advocate for their money, but at the same time you're telling your investors that you're actually making $5 million in profit. So we're,
something doesn't
something
line up.
doesn't add up.
Right.
So when we ask the simple question, we cannot get a clear answer. Right?
And this is why you've issued some FOIA requests, right, to try to get to the bottom of this.
Absolutely. So that's when we started getting, and now we have even, the Chicago Sun-Times is there now trying to get some of those public records, because recently Attorney General Lisa Madigan actually, ruled or recommended that those are public records because that's a public institution, or she recommended, because there's no law that actually
That covers it.
that covers it.
So are you, speaking of the laws, are you working advocacy anywhere in Springfield in order to change these laws or introduce new ones?
Yeah, actually, we recently I was in a forum in Batavia, and there was there's actually some work actually in the suburbs that have actually understand that there's actually some issues if Chicago pulls everyone into the mass. And I think we see some efforts by Representative Linda Chapalavia, who is working on certain bills to kind of have some guidelines for to really amend some of the things that are already done. I mean, we have, for instance, one real simple effort that we have right now, a big problem that we have in Chicago public schools, is that we have something called the Charter Commission. So, as you know, like some of like the different boards of education, they make the decisions for their districts.
Right.
Chicago has the only appointed board in the
Right.
whole state. It's politically appointed by the mayor. And they decide where, what is school, they evaluate schools. So I give you an example recently, Concept Schools. It was now, there was
I'm familiar with them. They actually were based in Turkey.
in Turkey, that's right, with religious affiliations and all that. Actually done a very poor job in in the only school that they run in Chicago. There's an underperforming school, but with a lot of political clout, as far as we understand. So even
That's Chicago Math and Science Academy.
the Chicago,
up in
Chicago
Rogers Park.
Absolutely, that's right. That's the school. So when the Board of Education, the Chicago Board of Education evaluated the school, they said, well, we cannot give you another, we cannot grant you an expansion if you are underperforming. But they actually went to the Charter Commission to overrule the CPS. And they actually approved recently seven new
charters.
not for only Concept, for other charter operators. Even though, so we really don't have any evaluation system that will tell us, well, where to guide policy then. Because even though we may have a system that is not working, that doesn't guarantee that we're not going to fund it. So where we're standing here, if we are funding underperforming districts, what is the
Rewarding underperforming
underperforming districts for the political clout, or I don't know, because of the investors. We really want to see, because it seems like every charter operator works in different ways too. So that's why we decided to even look into case studies, to understand, really how do they operate? And I think we ought to be looking as the taxpayers, we ought to be looking how about these private enterprises operate.
So you mentioned that there is some, I forget, representative out from Batavia who is actually looking at this.
Yeah.
I know with the Center for Literacy at UIC, are you, as the school or as the center, are you guys looking into this as well? Are you trying to develop some advocacy?
Yeah, unfortunately, as the schools, we sometimes is unfortunate, but sometimes we are called to remain objective.
Yes, you're an academic institution, even though it is also UIC,
but
is of course also funded by state dollars.
By
right?
state dollars.
Right.
And unfortunately, this is a very contested issue when we have actually bipartisan agreement on charters. So when you actually
raise the question.
Raise the questions. You never know who you may be pissing off.
Yeah,
Right. So,
right.
So
right.
I think it's unfortunate, but I think that even in the Center for Literacy, we decided to go ahead with the research, even is on my personal account. So with another team of researchers that are looking into the effects on the special education, the effects on ELL instruction, and I'm particularly interested in the finance aspect of that.
Yes. So what do you think are the steps that citizens should be thinking about and taking now? I mean, because it's one thing to identify a problem, it's another to try to fix it. So what would you recommend that parents and even just concerned citizens start thinking about and start gearing up to do?
I think it's important, first of all, to for instance, in Chicago, I mean, the misinformation is rampant. Yeah. I mean, we have parents very driven by the ties and the nice buildings, right? But what they don't know, for instance, the United Neighborhood Organization, they actually have one of the vice presidents was actually the same person selling the windows for the
for the buildings.
For the buildings, right? So there's a reason why those buildings look so nice, but you may not have textbooks.
Now, and that would be an illegal conflict of interest in the public schools. But here in charter, is that another one of those gray areas?
There's another gray area. I mean, we still, in fact, these individuals are trying to fight some back pay because he claims that he was unfairly dismissed from his post or unfairly misled to believe that he had to leave the organization because he's in the private realm. That where he believes that that is a private enterprise. But these are problems. I mean, as a taxpayer, I think that it's important that we understand how these institutions operate. Where does the money go? And also, like I think it's also important to start making sure that our representatives are actually knowledgeable about the issue. Because as far as like the United Neighborhood Organization, we have pretty much all the Hispanic politicians backing that because
it's a very powerful organization, right?
Politically, it looked at a glance, it looked like it was doing a wonderful thing. But
as with so many things, when you dig down and look at the details, the story may not be quite so rosy.
Right, that's right. The evil is in the details, oftentimes, right?
Often, yes.
Oftentimes. So I think that's what we ask. First of all, their parents, taxpayers, to be informed about how they operate. We are really in a state that is under very harsh financial conditions.
Money is scarce.
Money is scarce. Oftentimes we hear, in schools as well, the problem are the pensions. Pension is the problem. But we see like very high salaries for the executives in the charters. In the charters. So we have like people who, even this individual for the United Neighborhood Organization, until recently when he stepped down, he was making more than the mayor of Chicago. So I mean, how can we really?
And it's important to remember this is taxpayer dollars that are paying these salaries.
They're paying these salaries, absolutely right. So how can we be? I mean, it's a double moral in this. I think it's a double discourse when we're claiming teachers are to blame or like the teacher pension, but we're paying salaries of $300,000, $400,000. I mean, there's a double discourse that we gotta also understand. I mean, and we often don't know because there's no transparency. There's not really accountability. I mean, there's really a lot of talk about accountability, but when it comes to finance, these are very, very, very blurry lines.
You remember from All the President's Men, follow the money.
Yeah,
right. That's all.
Right.
And I think it's a standard rule of thumb. So is it fair to say that the first step that all the citizens should and all the taxpayers should be pursuing is transparency, right? That we have to, before we can take any action, we have to see what's really going on. Fair enough?
That's fair enough.
Yeah.
I think as in anything that we do, especially in education, I mean, these are our children's or next generation, depends on the quality of education they receive. So more importantly, so for us to be very vigilant on the operations, that every single penny is accountable. When we have, assistance is scarce, and the state pulling every time back and more back on public education. Recently, there was a report that.
Well, actually, before we go to there, we're already out of time.
Oh.
So I think you've made the point very succinctly. Really, accountability here. Follow the money. See what's really going on.
Yeah.
So, Byron, I want to thank you so much for being here, and we'll have you back again because it's a subject that will continue to be important for the foreseeable future.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I appreciate it.
And thank you for joining us once again on Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. You can find us every night, every Saturday night on Comcast Channel 19 at 8 o'clock. And you can see us on the web at publicperspective.tv. So until next time, thank you and good night.